Welcome to the second seminar of the term. And today we're going to continue a tradition that we have that some of our students that presented at TRB will be presenting today and for the next 2 weeks. So we're going to have 2 presenters today, and we're going to have questions after each presentation that is going to be roughly 15 or 20 minutes. Yeah. So we're going to have a presentation and then questions. So first it's going to be Bryan Blanc talking about bike and pet counts, and then Anais Mathez talking about the adoption of electric vehicles. Yeah, peer-to-peer system. All right.
Good to go?
Thank you. Go.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Bryan Blanc. I'm here to present to you today about a pilot study I was a part of for the Oregon Department of Transportation. This pilot study was conducting non-motorized counts in a statewide program. The research team for the project included Dr. Miguel Figliozzi, Dr. Christopher Monsieur, and Dr. Krista Nordback, and another graduate research assistant, Pamela Johnson. First, I'm going to briefly talk about the overall research project goals, and then delve into the details of the pilot study itself, which forms the basis of this paper the presentation is based on. So, for the research project, we were tasked with reviewing the best practices regarding statewide non-motorized data collection programs, so counting bicycle and pedestrians. We were also tasked with providing guidelines regarding site selection and locating of the data collection equipment and the data collection procedures. And lastly, we were tasked with performing a pilot study to test these guidelines we had developed. So within the pilot study, the technologies we used were 2070 traffic signal controllers and inductive loops in the bicycle lanes. The 2070 traffic signal controllers were outfitted with push buttons and logged the pedestrian phases so that we knew how many pedestrian phases were granted as a proxy for counting pedestrians. The inductive loops, of course, detected bicycles in the bicycle lanes. We then applied factors to both of these counts to estimate bicycle and pedestrian average annual daily traffic. In selecting a site for the pilot study, there were several criteria that we had to consider. There had to be an adequate volume of pedestrians and bicyclists on the site. The site had to be on Oregon Department of Transportation facilities, and it had to have a functioning 2070 signal controller with this Voyage software that would allow us to log these bicycle and pedestrian counts. Also, we considered staff support and recommendation from ODOT in selecting the site. So the site we settled upon was the intersection of Oregon 99 West and Hall Boulevard in Tigard, Oregon. This is a multi-lane arterial heading east-west and a minor arterial heading north-south. The land uses around the site are typical for suburban shopping centers with large parking facilities and many curb cuts and driveways and heavy traffic coming on all sides of the intersection. So I'd like to talk about some of the specifics of the pedestrian data collection. So to validate our automated data collection, we recorded 24 hours of video near the end of August 2013 using 3 cameras mounted on a signal pole. With the video, we could manually count the number of pedestrians using the intersection and compare that with the automated count that we received from the signal controller. So in first just looking at the video counts, this is a pedestrian volume distribution over the 24 hours that we considered. It's not typical for a commuting pattern of pedestrian volumes in that most of the pedestrian volume is concentrated in the middle of the day, which suggests that some of these pedestrians were possibly accessing the stores around the intersection or using it for recreation. We had to consider the group size of the pedestrians that were using the intersection. We got this from the video because the logged pedestrian phases would only tell us, okay, this phase had been granted a single time within the cycle, but we wouldn't know how many pedestrians were crossing during that time. So with the video, we were able to ascertain that. There were 440 groups of pedestrians observed over the 24-hour period and 596 total pedestrians when looking at the group sizes. Ideally, we would have observed 440 pedestrian phases. We ended up overcounting a little bit in pedestrian phases due to some errors that I'll talk about in a little bit. So On this slide is four scatter plots, one for each of the crosswalks, comparing the actual count of pedestrians from the video on the y-axis to the logged pedestrian phases on the x-axis. As you can see, the trend in the comparison is pretty linear. R-squareds are over 0.7, suggesting a pretty tight relationship, but there are some errors that I will discuss that contributed to the spread. When you consider different crosswalks, they had different errors associated with them that lowered their linear correlation. So the potential sources of error that we had to consider were, first, like I talked about, the pedestrian group sizes. There's a difference in phases versus the logged phases versus the actual number of pedestrians using that crosswalk. And then some pedestrians were pushing buttons for both directions at a corner, so we would end up overcounting phases. This is likely due to them maybe trying to get to the opposite corner and just seeing which signal phase comes up faster. And then we also observed some bicyclists using the pedestrian push buttons. As I'll talk more about later, a lot of the bicyclists using the intersection were riding on the sidewalk, so we're using the pedestrian phase to cross the intersection. We also observed a few bicyclists who were riding in the bike lane and then went up onto the sidewalk to push the button to presumably maybe get their phase faster. Overall, we observed 482 pedestrian phases logged by the signal controller and 440 groups actually crossing the intersection. This resulted in 91% accuracy when considering just the groups of pedestrians. When considering the actual number of pedestrians using the intersection, we had an 81% accuracy. Now, from comparing these two numbers, we developed a factor that would be used to convert the logged pedestrian phases to the actual number of pedestrians. Obviously, this factor could change for different conditions at each intersection. But in using this type of counting method, this factor would have to be developed. So from the analysis of the pedestrian video, it emphasized how important collecting video is to validating our data collection technology and also to understand this bicycle and pedestrian behavior at the intersection. We wouldn't know about the double button pushing and the bicycles coming onto the sidewalk without using the video. From the results here, it seems that counting pedestrian phases may be a promising and cost-effective method for estimating AADT for pedestrians. These types of signal controllers are widely in place around Oregon and across the country. But it is necessary to increase the number of sites where we conduct this kind of analysis and to conduct this analysis at different times of the year to get a wider sample and understand how different land uses and different temporal variations may affect the pedestrian patterns at different intersections. So now I'd like to change gears and talk about the bicycle data collection. So exactly the same as with the pedestrian data collection, we collected video for 24 hours at the intersection near the end of August 2013, and this validated our bicycle counts as we looked at the video manually and counted the bicycles. So in looking at a volume distribution over the 24 hours we considered, the bicycle volume distribution is a bit more typical for a commuter pattern, with the peaks taking place at the beginning and end of the workday. One of the peculiar things we noticed in considering the video for the bicycle data was that almost half of the bicycles using the intersection were riding on the sidewalk. So these would have never been captured by the bike lane inductive loops, which points to possibly the need for bike inductive loops on the sidewalk or some other data collection technology to capture these bicyclists. In summary, from the video data, we observed a total of 190 bicyclists using the intersection, about half of which were in the bike lane and half of which were on the sidewalk. So I'm going to talk about the inductive loops themselves that we used as the automated data collection technology. These were diamond loops, 6 of which were placed around the intersection, 2 on each of the north and southbound approaches, and 1 on each of the eastern and western approaches. Now, there were some peculiar different characteristics about each approach that I want to talk about that will inform kind of the errors we observed in the automated data collection. So on the northern and southbound approaches, there were 2 loops, They were wired in series, which didn't allow us to disentangle whether 0 bicyclists were counted, or 1 or 2, or if a motor vehicle was being counted instead. All we received was a binned count for 15 minutes for those 2 loops. So in the future, we'd like to possibly observe counts where the loops are wired in parallel, so we can get separate counts for each loop. On the eastern and western approaches, there was a single loop placed in a right side bike lane. On the eastbound approach, particularly, the loop was placed directly before a right turn pocket, and as suggested by the photo on the right, this led to some overcounting because we were detecting motor vehicles instead of bicyclists. So in looking at the percent errors observed from the count, you can see that the inductive loops didn't perform that well, having high percent errors in the 1,000% range. So because of these significant errors, we decided to collect another 24 hours of video with a lowered loop sensitivity because we were vastly overcounting the number of bicyclists, most likely because we were detecting motor vehicles. After we lowered the sensitivity, the percent errors did lower a lot. Most of them dipped below 1,000%. And on the eastbound approach, we still had a pretty significant error, likely due to the fact that the sensitivity was not the only problem here, but the location of the loop was problematic as well. So in summary, when considering using inductive loops to count bicycles, optimizing the sensitivity is really, really important to obtain accurate counts. There's no precise number that we can give DOTs that want to use this technology. They need to test with bicycles and motor vehicle traffic at the intersection to see what the right setting is to obtain accurate counts. The location of the loops in relation to right turning movements is also very important to consider. As we saw, the eastbound towards Portland approach was very inaccurate. And even for the northern and southbound approaches, which didn't have as problematic loop placement, the approach that had the higher right turning volume had lower accuracy. And finally, loops wired in series also added difficulties in determining whether a bicycle was detected or a motor vehicle was detected. So overall, again, this analysis emphasized the importance of collecting video to validate these automated data collection technologies, and also to understand these bicycle behaviors, particularly half of the bicycles using the sidewalk, which we would have never captured with just the inductive loops alone. Overall, the bicycle inductive loops performed with low accuracy in this study, but they have performed better in other studies, so possibly ODOT should test other loop configurations, other loop shapes, and analyze other intersections with better loop location to see if they have more success using this counting method. Overall conclusions when considering both the pedestrian and the bicycle count. The pedestrian counts utilizing the pedestrian phases and simple factors seem to be pretty promising. Not so good was the counting of bicycles using the inductive loops, but we did shed light on a number of issues that ODOT needs to consider if they're planning on using this method for counting bicycles. And we also noticed, and ODOT was very surprised, that there were 600 pedestrians using this arterial intersection over a 24-hour period. So this points to the need for these kind of data collections to really understand pedestrian bicycle activity. And overall, more researchers, of course, needed to generalize the results of this study, and another ODOT project is underway to do just that. So I would like to acknowledge our technical advisory committee at ODOT and various other ODOT staff members and PSU graduate students that helped make this project a success. And with that, I would be glad to take a few questions. Travis?
Who placed the loops, and were they all placed at the same time? Was it different people, different times?
I think it was all one time, and it was placed by the Oregon Department of Transportation. Marisa?
You not running a similar video study right now?
I had heard something about that, but I'm not totally sure.
And do you think that there's like a need for an actual cleanup person to do the video, to actually watch the video, go through and clean up that data? Or did you find that to be not necessary?
Well, from watching a few other presentations at TRB, the video recognition is not quite there yet, so manual counts are still needed, hopefully one day we'll get there. Anybody else? Andy?
Conclusion on the bicycle detector's effectiveness and their placement?
They were, a little disappointed in the fact that it wasn't as accurate as hoped, but they definitely valued all the things we learned, and hopefully we'll use that information in other loop placements and other count efforts. Gerald?
In terms of reviewing the videos, did you review the?
Yeah, I reviewed a lot of the video.
And I'm just curious, like in terms of the efficiency of watching it, do you have to sit there for the full 24 hours, or do you like?
Usually ends up being more than 24 hours because you're stopping the video, counting on an Excel sheet, going back, restarting it.
In a downtime, could you like speed up the video to twice?
Yeah, we did end up speeding up the video, but even with that, it still was taking per hour definitely more. I remember we did. I think it was probably around twice the amount of time that was collected. Patrick?
Do you have a sense of how many or what proportion of our signalized intersections, either in the region or in the state, are capable of?
I actually have a map of all of the intersections. I don't remember the price number. It was somewhere around 400 to 500 in the state. I'm not sure about the region one, which is Portland.
Could you talk a little bit more about your site selection process? Did you use objective data, subjective data? And if you did use objective data, did you do any preliminary routing analysis to look at population concentrations and existing destinations to kind of determine which might be priority intersections to evaluate?
Yeah, we considered a lot of different, both objective and subjective information in selecting a site. There were a couple other sites that didn't have, either only had bike loops on one approach or didn't have enough bike volume. But hopefully with this new study underway, we'll gather some more sites and see if there's some variation in the results. All right, well.
Do you think they'll abandon the loop counting system for the bicycles since the high inaccuracy?
Loops have performed better in other studies. With this study exposed some of the problems at this intersection. Loops are still widely used, especially because they're already in place in so many places. I don't think they're going to go away anytime soon. All right, with that, I'll probably pass it on to Anais to do her presentation.
Everybody, my name is Anais Mathez. I'm a graduate student in the School of Urban Planning here, and I'm working under the supervision of Jennifer Dill and Nathan McNeil. And today I'll be explaining a little bit about who's using peer-to-peer car sharing in Portland, Oregon, and what that kind of has been looking like in the city since it started about 2 years ago. So very briefly, I'll just explain what the overall objective of this study is, and then I'll talk about what the TRB paper was about that we presented just this week. So peer-to-peer car sharing is a system that facilitates people that already own vehicles and are willing to rent them out to people that are looking for vehicles to rent out. So it's a bit different than traditional car sharing systems like Zipcar or Car2Go, in that peer-to-peer car sharing capitalizes on kind of an already existing fleet of vehicles. It's maybe like the Airbnb of car sharing. And so this started in Portland about 2 years ago when legislation changed that allowed, that made changes with the insurance frameworks that allows people to rent out their cars in these kinds of schemes without having their insurance voided. So once that law became passed, a company called GetAround came onto the scene in Portland and started, was basically the company or the website platform that allowed for this interaction between owners and renters. And that's when we started our 3-year study here with OTREC, now TREC, and also it's sponsored by the FHWA. So it's a 3-year study, 2012 to 2015. It's going to be wrapping up this year. And the overall objectives of this 3-year study was primarily twofold, seeing whether or not a system like peer-to-peer car sharing, I'll say P2P from now on to streamline. So seeing if P2P car sharing could reduce overall VMT by marginalizing the cost of driving, and also looking into whether peer-to-peer car sharing could increase access to jobs and activities for those without cars. So our sample size for this study, we recruited about 335 car owners. And get around, in Portland, we have about 500 car owners, generally speaking. And then car renters, or people that are out there renting other people's cars, we have about 465 that have been recruited. And there are probably over 1,000 renters within the Portland area, but that number fluctuates. Also, just a note here about our rent. So I'll be presenting, the following presentation is about the renter side of this, this study. Last year, we had a paper and a presentation about the car ownership, or the car owners. Within the renters, let's move on. Within the renters, we have kind of 2 subsets. We have people that sign up for Get Around and are considered renters, but then within those people, we also have those that have actually completed rentals or have rental activity. So out of the 465 that we recruited, we had about 260 of those which actually had rental activity. But for the basis of these analyses, we kind of combine them where we see necessary and run analyses separately where that's needed. This is just a very brief timeline about how our methodology played out. But the way that we collect data was in sending out surveys. So we collected initial surveys, interim surveys, and final surveys to kind of assess differences in attitudes, motivations, activity, both before, during, and after their experience and their experience with Get Around. So here I'm just going to break down a little bit about the renter demographics from what we have here. So generally, we can say that most people involved in our study are fairly young and fairly well educated. We have about 65% are under the age of 35, and we have about 73% that have a college education or higher. And also something interesting here, so we just broke it up between all of the renter participants, those who have actual rental activity, and then we also compare it with the city of Portland. Some interesting things here is that we seem to have a much higher proportion of women in our study as compared to the city of Portland. And also interesting to note that just over half of our study participants have no vehicles in their households, and those that did have any rental activity were even more likely to not have a car in their household as compared to about a third of the population in the city of Portland. And also generally, study participants were a bit more likely to have incomes about over $75,000 as compared to the city of Portland. So this paper, this part of the research project, we wanted to look at the motivations behind, why people chose to rent through a peer-to-peer car sharing model, who they were, what they did, but also to test a typology of renters to kind of see what the market segmentation would be for the use of a peer-to-peer car sharing model. So based on the demographics, we formulated 4 groups for this typology based on these. So we have the high-income non-millennials, we have low-income non-millennials, we have non-student millennials, and we have student millennials. So the way that we kind of chose these groups was that, first of all, a lot of the literature out there and a lot of the trends shows that, these kind of sharing economy practices, car sharing services, tend to speak a lot more towards the millennials. So we have a big millennial category as seen in the demographics, which means people under the age of 35. And then we broke that up between students and non-students because students generally tend to have a bit more regular work schedules, and they also, or school schedules, meaning they might be traveling at different times. They might also be a bit more cost sensitive. So we broke the millennial category into those that have moved on into jobs and those that are still in their student phase. And then past that, we also noticed that obviously there's a lot of cost sensitivity. So we broke up high income versus lower income in terms of the non-millennial subgroup. Yeah, what else can I say about that? Yeah, so these are just basically some brief characteristics on the right about what, some of the general characteristics for each of these typologies. Okay, so the first thing that we asked was basically for people to rate a series of reasons as to why they would choose a P2P service. So we outlined here some motivations and some intended uses. Generally, the consensus was that there was like this general support for peer-to-peer car sharing, you know. And then secondly, a big thing was that membership was free, so they had nothing to lose. So when you sign up for Get Around, it's a very simple sign-up process. You just have to link your social media account. So there's no cost to sign up for this service. And then after that, then there's some more economic factors that come into play, as we can see here. There's also a few differences among the types. High-income non-millennials place a lot more importance on their interest in finding whether or not they could manage with one fewer car or maybe without a car. And then student millennials place a lot more importance on the higher cost of other car-sharing options like Zipcar or Car2Go. And then we also asked about their intended uses, and this temporally, at least monthly. And basically, as this indicates, all groups really showed a high level of interest in using peer-to-peer car sharing services, primarily for more like recreational trips, weekend recreation trips. And then most of the groups also, there's plan on using services for a lot of other reasons, but high-income non-millennials, their interest for using the service beyond recreation was generally a lot lower than the other groups. And then student millennials and low-income non-millennials indicated that they would use P2P car sharing more frequently for most purposes than at other groups. And then finally, something about the low-income non-millennials here. They had an interest in using the service for a high variety of purposes, and they stood out a little bit more for their stated intention of using P2P, more for transporting things and work-related travel, so maybe more necessity-related travel. So after that, once some of these renters in our study actually took a trip, we went ahead and asked them what the actual purpose of that rental trip was. So overall, based on the typologies, overall we can see that the most common trip was actually work-related, about 20%, visiting family, shopping and errands, and then some out-of-town recreation. Low-income non-millennials really stand out here in terms of the high percentage of those trips that were used for work-related travel and for shopping and errands. Overall, in the past slide, we'd seen that generally work-related travel was kind of like on the lower end in terms of their intended use, but the low-income non-millennials had also in the past stated that they would probably use this service for those means, and as we see, it seems like somewhat correct in that they did go in that direction in using that service. And then another thing here, okay. And then after, looking at what they used that trip for, we also asked, so, had this service not been available, like how else would you have substituted, or would you have substituted this trip? So some points here is that generally, 31% of trips for this, overall 31% of the trips would not have been taken had this peer-to-peer car-sharing service been an option. And millennials were most likely to not have taken a trip had P2P not been there. And then for the low-income non-millennials, 60% of those trips would have otherwise been taken by public transit. So, but we're a little, hesitant to jump into saying whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. But if anything, it could maybe indicate that they used car sharing because, or public transit was far too inconvenient of an option at that time. And so car sharing was something that really complemented, or basically increased their options in terms of being able to do different things or going places where transit may not have served them as well. Yeah, and then finally, we also see here in the high-income non-millennial, without peer-to-peer car sharing, they were far more likely to indicate that they would have maybe explored other car sharing services. And this is interesting relative to how that plays out with the other typologies, whereas exploring other car sharing options was a lot lower or almost non-existent for some of the other typologies. So we could maybe see, okay, high-income non-millennials are either already using a lot of different car sharing options and are kind of exploring different options, and they, they're using Get Around, but they also are a bit more exploratory in nature. But that's, up for debate still. And then some key findings, basically, from what I've just said here. So higher income non-millennials were overall less likely motivated by economic factors as we could imagine, and may have been motivated to join in order to test whether they could manage without a car or with one fewer. And their stated, basically, furthermore, their stated interests reveal some important differences, this basically indicates that they may have discovered a utility in the service, that they might not have realized when they had signed up for it or what they intended to use it for. Yeah, and so once again, I just want to reiterate that point that I had said earlier about maybe being a bit more exploratory in nature, and that they had access or were using other car sharing options, and that they were going ahead with Get Around as one more option, and so they were kind of juggling or looking at the pros and cons possibly. And then, so students and non-student millennials showed a preference for using the service for more discretionary trips, and that was really shown through the fact that in prior slide they had said something about how if P2P wasn't around, they wouldn't have actually made that trip. So maybe they're making more discretionary trips, like going out of town for recreational visits and whatnot. Whereas the low-income non-millennials seem to basically be making far more utilitarian trips. So taking these trips for more work-related shopping errands, some more necessities, trips for necessities and whatnot. So that kind of leads to this early indication as to, well, in using peer-to-peer car sharing for trips that are more non-discretionary, that this kind of service might be potentially expanding the mobility of these lower-income households. Yeah, and so I just wanted to wrap this up with some limitations of the study. As with any study of a sample, there's obviously a bias as to who participates in the study and who doesn't participate. Once again, our sample was limited to the city of Portland, so we don't actually know what kind of activities or motivations would look like, in more suburban locations. Also, another point too is early adopters of kind of a new service might be a bit different than adopters of a service that's been around for many years or people are more familiar with. So they might come out with different different types of study participants. And then finally, this is also, once again, based on very interim data. We will be finishing our data collection in the next few months. So these are really, this analysis is more exploratory in nature and just kind of looking at it in the interim, but we'll be having a final wrap-up paper that will probably come out at the end of this year, where we will hopefully tie up all these loose ends. All right, and that's it. Any questions? Yes?
I'm familiar with the pay structure for the car and car-to-go, but I don't. Could you explain a little bit about how you pay for it?
Sure. So car owners can be anyone. It can be your neighbor, you know, whoever. And they're the ones that decide how much they're willing to rent out their vehicle for, you know, $4 an hour, $15 an hour. We have some people out there that are renting their, you know, really expensive cars for like $50 an hour. Granted, they probably aren't recruiting a ton of people to rent their like nice Tesla, even though maybe that would sound really great for $50 an hour. So I think GetAround actually suggests to owners like around what kind of price they should be putting forth. And also, owners can kind of look around their area. It's a kind of a map-based web platform, so they're able to kind of visually look and see what the prices are in their neighborhood and maybe, put it to that. But yeah, it's kind of a balance of like low price, more renters, but then are you making very much money off of it? Yeah, Marisa.
Can you speak to just a little bit about the racial demographics of what you saw, and obviously not in a vacuum, but sort of in the context of Portland?
I don't, off of my head, have any information about the racial demographic. Oh, well, hold on. In the demographics, there was
13%
13%.
non-white.
Yeah. Sorry. There it is. Yeah. So, about the same as Portland in terms of, white participants. But yeah, non-white, 13%, which is a bit lower than the city of Portland, quite a bit lower. Yeah. Eddie?
So I know in the news right now, one of the things that people are talking about is around safety and stuff like that. So my assumption is that different participant typologies probably have different risk tolerances for safety.
Sure, yeah.
So I was just wondering if you know of any studies that have looked into that.
Mm-hmm. So when you're asking about safety, you mean safety in terms of having a safe vehicle to drive, safety in terms of trusting the owner to give you the keys and not...
Both, because I've heard both.
Yeah. Well, I don't off the top of my head know of any studies, but I'm sure maybe someone can speak to that. But...
One thing about this model that's different is that you're not actually getting in the car with someone. So it's different from like Uber and Lyft, wherein you're trusting the driver to take you someplace. Sure. You're in the car by yourself. So there's maybe different safety concerns.
And a little bit also. So GetAround offers an insurance policy. So GetAround is this, facilitating company, and they take a share of. I think they take actually like 40% of the profit or of the amount of money that is, that the owner will put forth. But that's used to offer an insurance policy for the renters. So I think, they take a share, but owners are covered by insurance. So in case anything does happen, they're not, that transaction is covered by this insurance policy. So.
Yeah, so I think you answered it. So the owner of the vehicle has to add some liability or something, or additional coverage.
Well, they don't have to add anything. GetAround offers that. Yeah,
Whenever somebody rents a car, that car is then covered by GetAround insurance. It's not covered by the individual policyholder. But the driver of the vehicle, if they do get in an accident, the insurance policy, as far as I know, is only covering the owner's liability,
yes.
not the driver.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I think
So it's like PIP coverage or whatever.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure.
Sorry, there's a lot of questions in the back, yeah.
Out of curiosity, if someone was to rent another person's car and say take it to downtown and rack up parking tickets, what happens at that point?
The renter is responsible for all of that. So, GetAround has all the necessary information for all the renters. When you're ready to rent, you have to have your driver's license, checked off by GetAround. So they have a way of following up with the renter.
The other thing is that many of the cars in GetAround's fleet have GPS monitors on them as well, so they can actually see where the car is, so they can track it to where the parking ticket was written as well. So
that's maybe something else I forgot to mention is that we also were able to collect empirical data from some GPS monitors called car kits that were installed in all of the vehicles for all the owners in our study. which Steve is busy digging into and which happens to be the worst data ever. But yes, we'll go up the
So how does the insurance cover stuff say about abuse of a vehicle? Like, you know, something that may not be apparent right there.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I think it's a little gray, but I mean, Get Around as the company is in this position where they are able to mitigate those problems or able to kind of have those conversations between the owners and the renters. I'm not sure exactly like if there's a standard framework for dealing with. I mean, I'm sure there is in customer service for dealing with issues. But I mean, yeah, I guess there is an inherent risk in that, you know, you rent someone's vehicle and you're not entirely sure about the condition of the vehicle and whatnot. So you are, you know, maybe maybe the car has really low tire pressure. I mean, I don't know. But yeah, so I'm not entirely sure what kind of standards or framework Get Around has in terms of ensuring some sort of or quality control. But yeah, I don't know if I answered that question.
Sorry? They tend to have that kind of thing in like car sharing, peer-to-peer.
Well, I was more talking about the renter taking a really nice car, doing something stupid, and then it doesn't come out, you know.
I mean,
they have the
handled just like anything else. It's like
yeah.
if you borrowed a car from one of your friends, they could sue you.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I mean, so there's no like liability after the fact of the rental.
Yeah, just anecdotally, having talked to some rent owners, so let's say an owner has a car that's a stick shift and someone drives it and maybe screws up the clutch, that kind of thing you're talking about. Yeah, Get Around does have a process to figure out, was it really the fault of the renter, and therefore are we responsible in some way before we get it out there. So they do have a process of dealing with that. Mm-hmm. We don't necessarily know the details of that because it's not part of our study, but yeah.
Yes.
Personally, I tend to make decisions on transportation very short notice, like 10 minutes, an hour. Is there any data showing how far in advance renters book the cars?
I'm sure there is. That's not something that we've necessarily digged in. There's a 12-hour window between when a renter requests a car and when an owner can approve or deny that request. Otherwise, the request goes null. But I think there's a feature coming to Portland in a few weeks called Instant, which is basically what it sounds like. You can request. You'll have owners that sign up for this program where people can request your car, and you get an instant, yes or no answer. I don't know the details of that, but yeah. Yes.
So, based on the data you got, do you think that the system increases VMT just because some people now get access to vehicles that otherwise would not? And the other part of the question is overall, taking into account changes in VMT and the benefit that people may get from trips that otherwise would not make. Do you think we should be promoting this kind of system?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big supporter, but I would be hesitant to say anything about the net change in VMT as a result of something like this. Yeah, sometimes we'll see that car sharing trips will replace, public transit trips, but I don't know based on this data and based maybe on the paper last year or to what extent yet that we would actually see an increase in VMT as a result of a car sharing service like this. If anything, those increases are probably fairly minute, and the overall net, there wouldn't be any overall net increase in VMT. But I think that's something, that's one of the big policy objectives, and I think that's something that Jennifer. Yeah.
To add some clarity to that, so our owners, the owner paper that we did last year, it looked into more of who the owners were that were involved, and there's quite a few owners that this was like their third or fourth car that they were putting up on the service. But there's also, we had a substantial number of one-car households that were putting their only car up on the service, and then using bicycling or using transit to get around otherwise. So there's going to be a lot of give and take in how this comes out. I don't know if it's going to be a huge shift one way or another.
Right.
Andy? I was curious about, you mentioned work-related trips.
Yeah.
Did you guys look into
how many of those were done, like the company that employs the person has one of these services, and therefore people use it because it's part of the company's hierarchy, as opposed to just like renting it independently in the company?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. I mean, we don't have that information. But I mean, that would mean that the company is finding personal and like individuals to rent out their vehicles for their employees. So maybe there's.
Well, you know, like the zip car and cardio, you can sign up as a company or an institution, and then your employees can use it.
Right. So yeah, I mean, this is a lot different, and that's it's more on an individual basis. It's not. I don't think companies can sign up and. I mean, I guess if a company's acting as like a single person and being like, oh, I'm gonna like request this car from, this business or this person across the street that works for my business, like, maybe, but I'm not sure that that's something that's part of this. Yes.
So how does it work? How does cardio or zip car, you go on the app and you pick the closest car, but how would this work? You have to go to that person's house.
No, so there's a few ways, yeah. It's also an app. It's a map app, and you can search for cars geographically based on price, based on all sorts of criteria. And there's two ways in which you get access to the car. There's a traditional way in that you make arrangements directly with the owner of the car to hand off the key in person. But the use of these car kits, which I had mentioned before, also act very similarly to those keypads that you find on Zipcar and Car2Go, where the app allows you to hold your phone to the keypad or to any car that has a car kit in order to unlock the vehicle. Not all cars that are on GetAround have a car kit. I don't know what the proportion is. All cars that are in our study have to have the car kit for purposes of data collection. But yeah, so there's two ways of handing off that key, is either by renting a car that's got this car kit where you can simply just unlock the car with your phone, or having a personal one-on-one interaction with the owner, or like leaving the key somewhere. Yeah.
So going through some of the open-ended questions from some of our surveys, I've seen instances where the owners actually go and pick up people from the airport and drop them off at their house, and they find a way home themselves. Or you can, people hand off the keys at a workplace or shopping center or at their own home. So I mean, it can happen anywhere, just up to the owner's discretion, basically.
I don't know if you've mentioned, but just in terms of the scope of the program, I was wondering, like, how big is GetAround?
Sure. Yeah. So in the very beginning, we had made just a little comment that about last year there was maybe about 500 people signed up as owners, like renting out their vehicles on the GetAround website, but that number fluctuates between some people will take their listing off or make it inactive. That's just in the city of Portland. And then by April of last year, maybe about a month before we cut off the data collection for the renter side, there was probably about a pool of 1,500 renters within the city of Portland. But that also, being a renter is a very gray area for GetAround, because as I had said, really all you need to do is link up your social media account to have an account on GetAround, and then when you start actually going forth and requesting a vehicle, then you would submit your driver's license information, and they'd have to check it off, and then you could go and and then you'd be cleared. But we haven't gotten that information from GetAround as to of the people that are signed up on their website versus those that are signed up and also have their driver's license checked off and ready to go.
So those are not your renter participants? Who are the renter participants?
So the renter participants are all those that access the GetAround website, and so in accessing the GetAround website, you have to have an account. And when you scroll through and look for vehicles, we had on the website a link that says, be a part of our study and to share information about your rental activity. So these renters, as I said, we have a population of about 465 of them, but only 260 of those have actually had rental activity. Meaning that they had, actually rented cars and not just filled out the survey. Yes?
What type of vehicles comprise the majority of like this sample? Is it like for one or multiple seat capacity? Is it like the little cute eco cars?
No, yeah. Sorry, that first picture was very deceiving. That is not it's basically any type of car. So I mean, you see, as I said earlier, you see a range. I think some people have their BMW up for rent and somewhere.
Yeah, there's everything from the smart cars to diesel trucks. So.
Yeah, there's a lot of people. There's a lot of trucks for rent, so people might use those for moving big objects. That was one of the. That was one of the things we had asked. To what extent would you be using this kind of service for transporting objects or people or pets or things like that? So there's a wide. I mean, it's any and every car that you see on the street. It could essentially be. So.
Okay. The majority are sedans. They're just like four-door sedans.
It seems like an interesting way to actually optimize the process would be that you actually exchange the car en route to a destination that you're going to. I was just curious, you measured it all the time that people spent to actually trade off the cars and actually go to the destination to go pick that up to kind of put it in as a measure of disutility of the service to look at how you could possibly optimize that.
The data collection that we get is not accurate enough to be able to do something like that. The GPS data that we get is sent to us anywhere between 3 to 5 minutes. So, I mean, you can have a trip that takes 3 to 5 minutes, and we don't actually capture that.
But do you mean that idea that the car owner is delivering the car?
However the exchange works, if the owner delivers it, or if the
I think
owner
the vast majority of it is the car is just parked at the person's house, and the renter comes and gets it.
Yeah,
that's the vast majority of how it happens.
Proximity was always like a big reason for choosing what car you would rent based on where you are. You might either decide to rent the closest, cheapest option, or or maybe farthest, cheapest option. I don't know. Yeah.
Great. So much. Join us next week. We have 2 talks, one about active shoulder behavior and the other one about factors affecting bicycle commuting. Thank you.
Great, we're done. Thank God. Yeah.